Hello and good afternoon. My name is Michael Stanley-Baker, and I'm going to speak to you today about how I use Docusky and other tools to do my research in the history of Chinese medicine and Chinese religions.
I'm speaking to you from warm and sunny Singapore, the Lion City of Southeast Asia. I'll describe to you how I use digital tools to find Materia Medica across wide genres in the Buddhist and Daoist canons, as well as contemporary medical texts. While my research focuses on Materia Medica, that is, plants, animals, and minerals that are used for medicinal purposes, these digital tools can be used to find any other manner of large vocabulary sets. These could include body gods, pantheons, ritual objects, architectural phenomena, basically any kind of vocabulary set that's a representative of a genre of knowledge.
My talk today will contain 5 separate sections. To begin with, I'll describe my research in plural medicine in the 6 dynasties and why it brought me to begin to use digital methods. I'll then just describe the set of tools that I use to do my research and the role that Docusky plays in that work. I will then describe 3 different examples of working with early Chinese sources that reveal new kinds of research that can be done with digital methods that could never be attempted before. But before I begin, I want to discuss how this project sits in the larger history of philology, sinology, and Daoist and Buddhist studies. It's often said in the tech world these days that disruptive technologies are the way to move forward and produce new knowledge.
Yet much less is said about continuity and the importance of preserving scholarly traditions, especially with the onset of new digital technologies that may or may not retain the precision of classical philology. This project is designed to retain the rigor of early philology while giving us the flexibility of new digital tools.
Since Sima Qian first developed his innovative format for writing the Shiji in the Han Dynasty, this model was taken up and adapted by compilers of the Han Shu and later writers who included the court library as part of their record of intellectual heritage. It was to make a lasting impression, defining the form for dynastic records for the rest of imperial history. By the end of the 6 dynasties, during the Tang, the invention of encyclopedias were ostensibly for training young emperors, but also proved useful for literati and poets, and now as well modern researchers who want to discover associations and traditional allusions. The Siku Quanshu, which you can see a reproduction of here, represents the fullest expression of the Sibu, or 4 categories model, for organizing libraries. This went through multiple reconfigurations since its first instance in the 6 dynasties, nearly 1600 years earlier. With the mass carving and printing in the 2nd millennium of first the Buddhist Tripitaka and later the Daoist Canon, whole new scopes of access and textual comparison could be made. In the 20th century, these were further developed into modern print editions, some now being produced by monasteries in southwestern China. And in recent years, excellent digital transcriptions have been produced by C-Beta, the Daizokyo text database, and now Kangripo, enabling us to do word searches across vast scales of literature. Note that Kangripo in the bottom right corner also allows us the ability to compare the digital transcription to images of the original lithograph text. We now have far more information at our fingertips than earlier scholars could have dreamed of, and the problem is no longer getting hold of the text, it's retrieval and organization. It was this problem of identifying the various kinds of data available in the Taisho that inspired Takakuso Jinjiro to expend huge amounts of energy compiling the 45-volume topical index to the Buddhist canon, the Taisho Shinshu Daizokyo Sakuin. In the 1970s, Christopher Schipper also produced the concordance of a Taoist text, the Huangtingjing. Together, Takakuso Junjiro and Christopher Schipper both recognized the problem of tracking the circulation of knowledge across textual traditional categories, and it's this problem which lies at the heart of the project I'll describe today. While my research concerns the history of medicine across medical, Daoist, and Buddhist communities, it addresses the same problems that Schipper and Takakuso saw, namely, how to discover and track traditional knowledge as it circulated across historical textual categories. Although my findings are specific to the history of medicine and religion, the tools of approach and critical methods have a wider application. In the following section, I will describe the historical framing of my study, why I chose to focus on the 6 dynasties as a test case, and the theoretical framework, which allows me to study the abstract concept of medicine through specific identifiable units that can be tracked by digital analysis. Historical studies of medicine typically describe change over time as the production of new texts and changing textual categories, producing timelines that look like this. Dynamism within medicine was the product of text editors, not practitioners. However, this imagines that the category of medicine itself was static. However, when we examine the imperial catalogues of the Han and the Sui dynasties, we see that medicine was dynamic. In the catalogue of the Han court library, we find that medicine and drug recipes were contained in the same section as the arts of transcendence, under methods and techniques, or fengji. However, by the time of the Sui dynasty, medicine had moved over to master's literature, or the zibu, whereas Daoist and Buddhist texts were excluded from the four sections entirely, forming a supplemental section all their own. This indicates that over the period of the six dynasties, there was a categorical shift that caused elite scholars to recognize Buddhism and Taoism as a discrete domain, the emergence of the recognition of religion. By paying attention to how these were framed, we can track the emergence between medicine and religion over time. Notably, this division was not absolute during the Sui, and it isn't today either, as we can still find many forms of combination of medical and religious practice. If we take this into consideration and include religious actors in our history of medicine in China, then our timeline would have to change to one that looked like this. Here you can see the activity of a gamut of different religious actors as they entered into the medical marketplace and became active. However, if you look at it more closely, you find that actually it encapsulates the same problem that earlier studies of the history of medicine have, which is that each type of actor, from transmediums to transcendents to celestial masters to Buddhists, for example, were imagined as siloed independent trajectories, and there's no way to describe the interaction across these different lines of development. So if we change our perspective, and instead of taking social groups and social textual categories as our basis, but we look at the therapeutic practices, we find that there's a much more complex picture which allows us to visualize the circulation of practice and thought across all manner of social and textual domains. In this chart, I've taken an imaginary set of actors. On the top side, you can see Buddhists, numinous or Lingbao, treasure Taoists, Shangqing Taoists, transcendents, transmediums, doctors, typing Taoists. And along the left-hand side, you can see a variety of practices: acupuncture, drugs, moxibustion, through to exorcistic, possession rites, body visualizations, and practices like Daoyin and circulating qi and fasting and sexual hygiene. When we looked at in this way, we begin to see that these groups were not so isolated after all. In fact, they shared quite a bit of varying practices and techniques and methods across these different sectarian and textual divides. The other advantage is that we begin to model culture as particulate practices, and these practices can then be described by looking for term clusters. We can look for sets of acupuncture terms, or body gods, or techniques for visualizing qi, or sexual hygiene vocabulary, and find out where these are populated across the different canons. For the pilot study that I undertook at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, I chose to focus on Materia Medica, because this vocabulary is easily defined and easily picked out within texts. Now I've described the framing and scope of the project, I'll go on to describe the digital tools with which I'm studying it. I was lucky to work with a number of great people, from Chen Shipei at the Max Planck Institute for History of Science, to Lin Viet and Brent Ho at Leiden and at the Max Planck, to Joey Hong at Dharma Drum Institute in Fagoshan in Taipei, and Zhang Chaoran, who helped mark up the Daoist texts, and the great team at National Taiwan University's Research Center for Digital Humanities, who you can see at the bottom. A number of scholars also contributed to the projects, providing either digitally transcribed texts or vocabulary lists, for which I'm very grateful. The problem with print catalogs and canons is that paper materials are too fixed, and the categories with which earlier catalogers produced these catalogs don't suit modern researchers' purposes. And so we needed to develop digital tools that would enable us to have the flexibility to adapt to any manner of different categories. For example, my notion of medicine, which includes incantation and drugs and visualization and bodyguards, wouldn't necessarily be suitable for another researcher who may want to adapt a different set of criteria. Conversely, current databases only allow you to input 1 or 2 or 3 terms, and then they produce lists of hundreds of search results which are unreadable by humans. How many times have we input a single search term to then be told that there are 4,300 results through which a human reader cannot possibly sort through? This points to the needs for situated search results, which narrow our searches down and give researchers the flexibility to organize them according to their own research purposes. I want to be able to search for large sets of practice vocabulary, in this case, a list that I've developed of 11,000 names for Materia Medica, and I wanted to analyze them according to philological criteria, the time and location where the texts were produced, the sectarian affiliation of the authors, and the intellectual genres within which they produced them. The basic research exercise is to learn how to situate repertoires of practice. The driving question is, how was healing knowledge and practice organized? We use digital methods to sort through the canon to identify who knew what, when, and where, leaving the road open for historical analysis using humanistic methods to answer the question why and how. For the 2017 pilot study, I chose to examine the distribution of drug knowledge in the 6 dynasties across surviving Daoist, Buddhist, and medical texts from the period. For Daoist texts and Buddhist texts, I had about roughly 800 and 900 chapters from each canon, which exist in excellent quality transcribed editions on the Kanseki repository or Kangripo, as well as in CBeta. These have excellent metadata, and the medical texts I sourced from a variety of locations and counted up to about 114 juan of existing surviving medical literature. As for the metadata, we're lucky in that roughly a third of the texts in the Buddhist canon have clearly defined sites of production, which have been mapped out onto GIS tables by Dharma Drum, and I have just recently completed at Nanyang Technological University a similar GIS database for the entirety of the Daoist canon. This means that fairly soon we'll be able to analyze search results by where the texts were produced, which marks a significant leap in our philological toolset to include spatial dimensions of text production, and a significant greater leap in understanding about the circulation of knowledge and the networks through which they were transmitted. The workflow of the project has gone in 3 stages. First off, we developed tools to do statistical analysis and discover where the texts were in both canons that had the highest amount of Materia Medica information. Then we selected those texts that have 20 drug terms or more within them and marked them up in teams in Taipei using Markus. And now we're working through those, cleaning up that data, and we're able to visualize the GIS locations that are associated with those drugs according to historical name databases. And we're able to do further analysis such as textual proximity, genre differentiation, which I'm going to go on to discuss today. Docusky does not rely on the complex methods of syntactic parsing or topic modeling, whereas parsing requires linguistic analysis of sentence structures, a field still under research for literary Chinese. Topic modeling uses the bag of words approach, assuming that words are related just because of their statistical co-occurrence, without understanding what any of the words actually mean. By contrast, Docusky's approach is intuitive to humanistic scholars and retains continuity with the backbone of sinology, the philological method. Rather than putting mathematical algorithms on the driving seat, Docusky doesn't attempt to model the topic because it assumes you, the historian, already know what you're looking for. The question is not what do the texts mean, but rather, where does the topic I'm looking for exist and how was it organized? It's a bit like creating a sand painting. If you imagine the granules of sand or your vocabulary set, and the glue is where these vocabularies stick, you throw your words at the canon and you give them a shape through the statistical analysis, and out comes your picture of the distribution of knowledge. Here's a screenshot of what that sand painting looks like. On the far left side, you see the titles of each text divided according to the specific juan. And then the third column in is the total count of terms of individual vocabulary that's occurred. The following column is the total amount of times that all of those terms occur in the chapter. Then you have your term list, and then another cell gives you the list according to the frequency each term occurs. Using bibliographic data, we can begin to filter out the texts. As you can see here, the blue texts are medical, the green texts are from the Daoist canon, and the yellow texts are from the Buddhist canon. Using this data, we can then begin to filter through into the different sectarian divisions in early medieval China. This graph shows how Materia Medica are circulated across the different early medieval sects. Once we'd identified texts of interest that had a large amount of Materia Medica, we used Markus to work with them on an individual chapter level, dividing each chapter into paragraphs and confirming whether automated identifications were actually drug terms or not, and adding in extra annotations about what those drugs meant in that particular text. This data can then be output as Excel tables. Furthermore, Markus grants us the ability to pull in GIS codes from the historical place name databases such as Harvard's CHGIS, as well as Fa Gushan's digital name authority database. For this exercise, we compared those two databases with an existing Materia Medica geography dictionary that was just recently published. Once those place names have been tagged with codes from Dharma Drum or CHGIS, they can be visualized in Docusky across terrain maps of China, or underlays of political maps from various dynastic periods. This map shows the northern and southern kingdoms at 497, just around the time the Bencao Jingjizhu was compiled. The maps also have excellent granularity, allowing you to zoom in to the prefectural level. Now that I've given you an overview of the tools and some of the methods, I'm going to talk about 3 historical research cases, and the first will be to discuss how vocabulary proximity within the Buddhist Vinaya reveals new questions about the transmission of medicine between India and China. Recall the data table which showed the location of Materia Medica names across all 3 genres of literature. By using simple filters, we can single out just the terms that appear in Buddhist texts. It turns out that the texts that have by far and away the highest number of drug terms turn up in the Vinaya, or the monastic codes. Together with National Taiwan University, we developed an easy-to-use output in Docusky, which simply shows the drug terms in one column and the title of the text in the other. You can see in the column on the left we have the Shisonglu, or Sarvastivada, which is followed further down by the Mohasangqilu, or Mahasangika Vinaya. This table can be directly copied into Palladio, a free online service offered by Stanford. Here you can see how Palladio shows the proximity or distance between texts. The terms either cluster around the darker gray dots, which are the titles, indicating they are unique to that text, or they are linked between 2 or more texts by thin gray lines, indicating that they are shared across them. In this way, we can get a very quick comparison of the vocabulary sets in ways that are impossible for pen and paper scholarship. This example shows the 5 texts of the Vinaya on the lower left, which were translated in the 5th century, compared to the Zhou Hou Feng, a Chinese recipe text by Gohong, which he compiled in the early 4th century. Only a few paltry terms are shared across these 2 genres, showing the great distance between Buddhist and Chinese medicine at the time. This example compares the Vinaya to the 6th century Bencao Jingjizhu compiled by Tao Hongjing, and as you can see, very few drugs are shared across the 2, indicating that Buddhism and Chinese medicine have not come very close in that time. If we look more closely at the Vinaya themselves, we find that there is something even more interesting. Now recall that they are ostensibly records of the Buddha's command to his disciples that were later recorded by different monastic communities as they spread across different regions of India. This map is hypothetical, and the history of the Vinaya is too complex to describe here. But on the face of it, one would imagine that the different Vinaya should demonstrate some form of continuity. However, when we look at the term distribution across the 5 works, we see that the terms show the exact opposite. The clusters around individual texts are much larger than any of the clusters of shared terms, showing that the texts demonstrate a higher degree of uniqueness to one another. This poses an interesting historical problem. On the one hand, it could be that different 5th century translations adopted different vocabulary for rendering common material into Chinese. If the medical translations demonstrate a higher degree of uniqueness than other terms of Buddhist practice do, it would seem to indicate that medical knowledge circulated less commonly across communities, and may tell us something about the transmission of medical knowledge among monks in China. On the other hand, it's possible that the different Vinaya themselves contain traces of different regional material practices back in India, from where the Vinaya were composed, and can give us an insight into the early history of Indian medicine via a 5th century Chinese translation. In the next section, I'll discuss how we can use these tools to navigate the Taoist canon and use them to make new contextualized discoveries. I've written an entirely new set of metadata for the digital Taoist canon, which uses the category divisions and periodizations of Christopher Schipper's Daozang Tongkao to filter the texts. I've included detailed biographical data on authors, editors, publishers, and other kinds of hands who produce the texts, which is drawn both from Schipper and from Kangripo. In addition, I've augmented these with GIS data for all known sites of production or editing of the texts, so at last we can begin to search the canon geographically. Using Schipper's categories, we can now divide up the 6 Dynasties Taoist texts by volume. For example, by counting the proportion of juan that survived in the canon, we can get an approximate picture of the different volumes of production or preservation of the different text categories, as you see here. We can also get a sense for which sects were producing the most medical literature. This chart shows all juan which contain 20 or more drug terms. As we would expect, the highest volume is the Shangqing sect, and then philosophy and alchemy come second and third. Philosophy looks at first like a mistake, until you note that the Daozang Tongkao, Schipper's catalog, includes the Baopuzi under philosophy. The Baopuzi is a text which includes a great deal of detailed descriptions of medicine and alchemy. If we look at the drugs within the Shangqing canon, we can see that the highest populated drug texts are the Zhenggao, the Declarations of the Perfected, and the Jiuzhen Zhongjing. And we can also see that there is a core vocabulary. There's a set of shared terms that are shared across a number of different texts, which are worth mining out. If we select out just the Zhenggao and the Jiuzhen Zhongjing, we can see again that they share very little common vocabulary. Now, say I wanted to investigate a little more into the Jiuzhen Zhongjing, I can then load the text into Markus and throw the entirety of my 11,000 terms at the text, and Markus will automatically populate where all of the drug vocabulary turns up, allowing me to scan very quickly through to where the drug action is. It turns out that this method is actually philologically viable. Now, I'm not doing violence to the text because what I find is that at the top of this cluster of terms, there is in fact a recipe title, indicating that the authors or compilers of this text themselves were pasting together different earlier sources. Here, it's the Shendan Fangjing. A quick scan through reveals that these are all minerals, indicating that this is most likely an alchemical text, which is what you would expect from a title called the Shendan Fangjing. So I can make a mental note about that. Scanning further on into the Jiuzhen Zhongjing, I found another recipe titled the Taiyi Dazi Jinyuan Feng, which is predominantly plant drugs. Now I have more material with which I can make investigations into comparing this collection of drugs with those in other recipes elsewhere, and begin to make arguments, build arguments about genealogies of medicine within the Shangqing Ufu. But the alchemical contents of the text are intriguing, and I can take this text and compare it to others in the alchemical corpus, as identified by Schipper et al. In the Daozang Tongkao. Interestingly, we find that the Jiuzhen Zhongjing is much less unique to the alchemical corpus than it is to the Shangqing. See how the Jiuzhen Zhongjing has far fewer unique terms against the alchemical corpus, as indicated by the smaller number of characters clustered around the title. We can use this method to reconsider the cataloging in the Daozang Tongkao, but also to investigate the deeper relationships between texts and whole entire genres. You may be wondering what I meant by the enigmatic phrase, just throw your vocabulary at the text. So I'll give a brief description of how that works here. If you go to Markus, and you can see the link above here, and then paste your text here, you'll get a window wherein you can paste in a text. Then make sure to give it a file name with alphabetical letters. Don't use Chinese characters. And then once you submit that file, you'll be given a choice of 4 options. you can just skip for this version the AB and go straight to C, the keyword markup beta. This bypasses the formal setting up of a text properly for a Marcus database, but enables you to get a quick down and dirty assessment of what are the contents of the text. When you're in the keyword markup arena of Marcus, then just click the Submit Keywords button, as you see indicated by the orange arrow, and in the box, dump your list of vocabulary items that you're looking for and that you've already used to find in Docusky. And then in the top box, give this set of terms a title. So I've given this drug name, and then to the right of it you can also select the color. Once you've selected the color, then click Submit Keywords. And Marcus will pop up a happy little message telling you that it has found 137 drug names. Okay, click OK. And then, to make these drugs highlighted better in your text, go and click on the button, drug name, that you see indicated by the arrow in the top right. And as you see in the bottom left, there is one drug term. It's actually a false hit, yunu, which is a jade maiden. It does refer to a drug in some cases, but in this case it doesn't. It's just a minor deity. But I want you to pay attention to the change in the format of the highlighting. As you repeatedly press the buttons for the different tags, the highlight changes, increasing or decreasing its visibility, enabling you to better navigate the text. Once you've highlighted the terms and made them easy to see, then it's easy to navigate down the text and see where all the action is. See here, where all these terms cluster under this recipe title. Marcus offers the ability to edit these automatically discovered terms, to download them as Excel files, and to keep a structured record of what you've read in your text. To get a preliminary output before doing any data cleaning, you can tick on Tag Summary, and you can see a sum of the terms that have come up and their frequency. You can output these by clicking the Excel button, which will give you a tabulated data sheet of what you've found. For more details on cleaning the tags and managing your data, please visit the Marcus website. In this next section, I'm going to discuss one use I found for geographic data in the Bencaojing Jizhu, in this instance for the study of excavated literature. I'll take this moment also to reflect on the ways digital analysis does violence to primary sources, and the kinds of attention we need to give when working in the digital humanities. In 2012, workers digging a subway in the Tianhui region of Chengdu, also known as Laoguanshan, uncovered a Western Han tomb which contained among it some revolutionary medical texts on bamboo strips. This find is very significant and is reshaping the way we understand the emergence of early Chinese medicine. In advance of the workshop that I was asked to attend on the manuscript, I was given a preview of a list of drugs that were contained on the manuscript. And so I compared them to drugs that appeared in these other three texts in a roughly contemporaneous period of the Han Dynasty, broadly speaking. And here we find our first instance of philological violence. Rather than giving me a complete transcription of the text, which the excavators were not yet ready to release, I was given the list in this form, which you see on the right-hand side, categorized according to Bencao forms of organization that post-date the text by at least 600 years. Furthermore, as you can see, the herb names are all transcribed in Jianti, not in Fanti, and certainly not in the original Chujian of the original script. I then compounded this philological violence as I compared the list to drug terms appearing in the other three texts. In order to make a computer recognize them as comparable, I took high-quality digital transcriptions of those texts and deleted the characters that had no modern counterparts, but which had been transcribed into new specialized fonts. You see them circled here in red. I replaced them with their etymons, or 视读字, that is, modern reading equivalents which had been provided by modern paleographers, and you can see them behind the characters in red, enclosed in brackets. So deleting the red characters and removing the brackets. As far as I'm aware, none of the authors whose texts I used compared each other's transcriptions. We can't say that the characters I used were produced by a consensus of paleographers, but we can say that they were produced within the professional paleography community. In this slide, you can see how the four different texts compare, the degree to which they shared common drug terms, and also the degree of parity they have with the Bensao tradition. However, I took this comparison one step further, and I plotted out the GIS distributions of the plants as their locations are described in the Bensao literature. Note that the Bensao literature is at least 700 years older than many of these texts, and therefore there's a considerable degree of anachronism as regards the attribution of these locations to these herb names. So there are a number of false equations that digitization seems to fluidly pass over, but which we as philologists need to keep our readership aware of. First, as I mentioned, the Bensao literature postdates the excavated texts by as much as 500 or 600 years. We cannot be sure that the same medical traditions were sustained in the same region in the same way over such a long time. Secondly, drugs were subject to frequent substitution practice. If a drug is not available in a given region, local inhabitants very often resort to substituting that drug with a local variant, even to today. Thirdly, even today there is little confidence about the direct identity between Chinese plant ethnonyms and scientific botanical entities. With these in mind, however, we can be confident about one thing, and that is the continuity of naming practices in particular regions. When a plant is identified in the Bensao as coming from a particular region, we may not be sure what the plant is, but the historical record gives us clear data that some plant from that region was given that particular name. With this in mind, let's turn to the excavated text and where the Bensao identifies these plants as having come from. In the first image here, we see Shuanggudui in Fuyang and Anhui, and you can see the yellow dot where the tomb is excavated and where the pink dots where most of the drugs are described to have appeared. There's not much focus around Shuanggudui, but you can see there's a general centralization in the central plain. With the Hantanpo excavation in Wuwei, you can see that there are some more Western drugs in the top left corner, and there's a generally Western migration, but there's not a real significant change from the general pattern. So it's unclear at this point whether or not we're seeing anything, a distinctive pattern. With the Mawangdui texts in Changsha, you can see there's much more clustering towards the center, but still there's nothing really terribly definitive. However, it's here with the Laoguanshan find that we find the most distinctive and very interesting evidence that although the text was excavated in southwestern China, the herbs all clearly come from the Far East and north up in the state of Qi. At the time when I was giving this paper, I got this data extracted on the morning of the workshop, and I had no idea about the other arguments that the other scholars were going to be making at the workshop. However, it turned out that every person that day, on the basis of paleography, mythography, and textual filiation, all made the same argument that the text, despite having been excavated in Chengdu, actually originated from the state of Qi. And it turns out that this botanical argument corroborates that same evidence. So, in addition to the exploratory methods that digital philology offers us through the combination of Docusky, Markus and Palladio, and the fantastic databases at Fagoshan and CHGIS, we also should be aware of something called critical digital philology. The making of texts comparable may make them, for digital purposes, may standardize them, but that loses the specificity of characters and other regional characteristics of the manuscript. Similarly, while the text becomes searchable, we do have the problem of transcription errors, which constantly need to be monitored. And while we can map out these places now, this raises questions about needing much more clarity on what these places meant to the people who occupied them or circulated through them. And fourthly, well, there's this potential possibility for increasing ecological kinds of arguments. We need to have more clarity about continuity between ancient plant names and modern botanical terms, and how the degree to which we can make reliable ascriptions between the both of them. While my writing up of the researches that I've just described to you continues, and while I continue to want to use these tools for developing scholarship in the history of medicine in early medieval China, I invite all of you to try out these tools and to begin to use them for other purposes. Very soon, in November of 2018, we will publish an entire composite set of the Buddhist and Daoist canons, which you can use to do all manner of research on any topic that you can describe as a representative vocabulary set. It could be pantheons, it could be legal terms, could be archaeological or architectural or economic items or ritual objects. Any topic that you can imagine where there's a representative set of vocabulary that you can go in and begin research and then augment that list through continued markup in Markus. On the other side, I see the utility of this database for intralingual research, and I want to continue developing it in that vein to begin to research the philology of things. That is, how can we track the continuity of objects as they move across regions and languages? To that end, I'm investigating with colleagues from around the world the building up of medical textual corpora from the major medical traditions around the world in order to begin to compare the transmission of Materia Medica across regions and across languages, and hopefully build a link from East Asia all the way to the Mediterranean and beyond. I invite you to join me either in East Asian religion, medical history, or in any other discipline for that matter, through the use of Docusky and the satellite of amazing tools that are being developed in the East Asian digital humanities ecology, and in our future researches about the travels of Materia Medica across the world. Thank you very much.